Uganda is a tiny landlocked country in East Africa, surrounded by South Sudan to the north, Kenya to the east, Tanzania and Rwanda to the south, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo to the west. And like most countries in the region, it was subject to European imperialism and the scramble for Africa. But if you've seen my other videos about the decolonization of Africa, you'll realize that what it meant to be a colony varied drastically from colony to colony. Some, like the Congo, were slave camps used to harvest raw materials for the enrichment of a single man. Others, like Rhodesia, were failed attempts at settler colonialism started a century too late. And others, like the southern part of Sudan, were largely left to their own devices, and thus were unprepared for those who weren't. Of all of these, Uganda most resembles that last category. In fact, the only reason they acquired it as a colony was to make sure that other Europeans couldn't. The peoples of Uganda are divided into two broad language families. In the south, the tribe spoke Bantu languages, while in the north they spoke Nilotic languages, which makes them related to the people of South Sudan, which becomes important later. The North and South would develop their own political structures, with the North being far more decentralized, ruled by local chiefs. And in the South they developed more centralized governments, establishing kingdoms over larger swaths of territory. Northern Uganda is mountainous and has poor soil, which made it ill-suited to agriculture, whereas the lowlands in the south was nutrient-rich due to proximity to the source of the Nile. This led the peoples of northern Uganda to predominantly become herders, which also resulted in a larger percentage of that population remaining semi-nomadic until European contact. In contrast, the south would become predominantly agrarian, mostly operating family or tribal subsistence farms. The 19th century would begin the outsider penetration of Uganda, but it wasn't the Europeans. The Napoleonic Wars brought the Alawiya dynasty to power in Egypt, who were looking to expand their territory to the south in order to tap deeper into the Saharan and Arab slave trades. You are aware that the reason for all these efforts and expenses is to get blacks. Please show zeal in carrying out our wishes in this most important matter. At first, they captured and sold black Darfurians into slavery, despite them being practicing Muslims. But as the Egyptians pushed further up the Nile, they encountered the Nilotic and Cushitic peoples of South Sudan and northern Uganda, who were primarily Christian or pagan, and sold them into slavery. The British would first encounter Uganda in the 1860s, when the Englishman, Sir Samuel Baker, was hired to lead an Egyptian expedition into western Uganda, with Charles Gordon being appointed governor, serving in the role until he was killed by the Mahdists in 1885. Stories of the slave trade would make their way to Europe, where it became a popular humanitarian cause of the day, especially amongst missionary societies, with putting an end to it made a justification for imperialism. This became one of the central tenets of the white man's burden, freeing men from slavery and tyrants, followed by saving their souls through the spread of Christianity, and finally improving their standards of living through economic development, all of which brought honor and glory to the mother country. Now, much of this gets written off by Marxist historians as well as other subaltern and anti-imperialist activists as just a thin veneer to justify material exploitation and cultural oppression. But when you read the primary sources from the 19th century, it really does seem like a lot of them genuinely believed that they were bettering the lives of the indigenous peoples. Once trade began to flow down the river, the effects would be miraculous. The province would be rich, the naked blacks, now living in misery on the banks of the Nile, prey to the slave raiders, would soon be well off as the fellahin in Egypt, and the slavers would give up slaving and turn to legitimate trade. During one of his numerous expeditions in Africa, Henry Morton Stanley would meet with King Mutesa I of Buganda and signed a treaty with him which allowed Christian missionaries into his territory, as well as an alliance with the British Empire. When the scramble for Africa and Berlin Conference eventually happened, this treaty was Britain's justification for Buganda being part of the British sphere of influence in Africa, and this would be solidified in 1890 with a treaty between Britain and Germany. Like with many of their other colonial ventures, they initially tried to have a royally chartered corporation, the British East Africa Company, govern the territory. In exchange for the monopolies on the extraction of export of raw materials from Uganda, the company was expected to invest in infrastructure and civil institutions, but the company had trouble getting private investors. This was partly because Uganda was landlocked and didn't have any readily accessible railways to deliver raw materials or cash crops to ports. But the bigger reason was the political instability of the indigenous politics, which resulted in the British government taking control from the company in 1893 and then declaring it a protectorate in 1894. And you can declare your support for this channel by supporting it on patreon.com/casualhistorian. When the sponsors and the algorithm aren't giving these videos a fair shake, the patrons help mitigate the blow. And I would like to thank the newest patrons who have joined since the last video: Nick Sabine, Dave Ledger, and Josiah Hughes. The support in them and all my other patrons allows me to focus less on the things that are out of my control and more on just making interesting videos for you guys. Members of the Patreon also get access to a members-only Discord server, early access to ad-free versions of these videos, as well as getting your name in the end credits of videos. They also get access to the scripts and notes that I use to make the videos. They also get access to patrons-only polls to decide on future video topics, such as right now there is a poll on there for what video I will make when the Patreon eventually hits $500 a month. And right now it seems to be neck and neck between a video on the Troubles and the history of Armenian genocide denial. So if either of those videos interest you and you want to make either of them happen faster, then join the Patreon and vote. And it's now even easier to join because you can now get a discount if you sign up for a full year to the Casual Historian Patreon. But of course, most of the people who join either mine or most other Patreons don't do so because of the perks, but rather they do so because they like the videos we make and they want to help us make more. And the perks are mostly just for us creators to show our appreciation. And so to all of my patrons, past, present, and future, thank you. But with that out of the way, let's get back to the history. But the bigger reason was the political instability of the indigenous politics, which resulted in the British government taking control from the company in 1893 and then declaring it a protectorate in 1894. The Kingdom of Buganda was fighting with the Kingdom of Bunyoro, while both were internally divided between Protestant rulers and Catholic subjects. The smaller neighboring kingdoms of Toro and Ankole were quickly to submit to British rule, but Bunyoro would resist. Its king, the Mwanga, tried to initiate a rebellion against the British, but the majority of his forces would side with them, deposed the king, and proclaimed his infant son the new king. The British would then merge the kingdoms of Buganda, Toro, Ankole, and Bunyoro into the Protectorate of Uganda, along with the Nilotic-speaking northern Uganda, which was governed by a decentralized system of local kings and chieftains. Now, popular depictions of empire like to portray them as long-term Machiavellian conspiracies, when in reality, most of them were rather accidental and ad hoc, and the British were no exception. Uganda in general, and northern Uganda in particular, was not acquired because the British had some grand plan for extracting resources and exploiting local labor, but solely to prevent the French or Germans from obtaining it. The process of acquiring Uganda did not proceed to a logically worked out program or plan. The main explanation for the haphazard nature of the process by which British rule was extended over the whole of Uganda seems to be that the procedure of carefully laid out plan and programs was un-British. One associated these procedures with the Germans or the Belgians. Just like the company government, the colonial government would be run on a shoestring budget of £50,000 a year, which today would be just under £5.5 million. A fair chunk of that budget would be used to recruit mercenaries from southern Sudan to act as law enforcement. Prior to the scramble, most of Britain's colonies had been, or eventually became, economically self-sufficient, which became the top priority for its African colonies. Uganda eventually becoming one of those after putting down the various civil wars and internal conflicts, religion being a major factor. Christian missionaries were active in Uganda for several decades before the British arrived. Anglican missionaries typically proselytized to the upper classes of Uganda, while French Catholic priests would proselytize to the lower classes, resulting in a Protestant ruling class governing a larger number of Catholic subjects. The fighting between the Protestants and Catholics in Uganda became a big drain on the company finances, to the point where they were contemplating abandoning Uganda altogether. The British government didn't want to intervene in the affairs in Uganda, but there was popular demand back home to do so. The plight of Christians in that part of the world had become a popular rallying cry, and missionary societies were leading the charge, and decrying the abandonment of them as abandoning the Christians of Africa to Mohammedan slavers or to the barbarism of the French and Germans. This forced the British government to take over administration of Uganda in 1893, making it a protectorate in 1894. But you can't really blame the missionaries for creating this political conflict, considering that they mostly fell along pre-existing political conflict lines. What you can credit the missionaries for, however, was creating the educational system of Uganda. In fact, the vast majority of schools in colonial Africa were started and administered by European and American missionaries, but this would have the impact of creating inequality amongst the indigenous Ugandans. The introduction of Western education and values had effectively disenfranchised those who, for one reason or another, did not get that education. 80% or so of the population were largely spectators rather than active participants in the events leading to the granting of independence. Most of Uganda's native political leaders would be those who received a Western education and received high levels of trust from the public, for better or worse. Because most of the schools were being run by foreign missionaries, they catered to their co-religionist converts. But if you were from a religious background that the Europeans didn't particularly care for, well, then your educational opportunities were drastically limited. In particular, this meant the Muslim minority, which resulted in Muslims taking the role of low-skilled urban jobs such as butchers and taxi drivers. But the missionaries weren't able to cover all forms of education, as most Ugandans, regardless of religious affiliation, would lack access to secondary and post-secondary education. So far as secondary education is concerned, there is no exaggeration in saying that the whole of tropical Africa possessed only a handful of secondary schools up to the time of political independence in the late 1950s. Some of the characteristic examples must make painful reading for Europeans who have wished to believe in the reality of trusteeship. For the majority, then, colonial education either had no meaning because it did not touch them, or none that was useful as an instrument of cultural enlightenment. Unsurprisingly, the British gave preferential treatment to Christian chiefs, but this religious discrimination wouldn't be limited to just non-Christians. They would recreate Northern Ireland and Africa by giving preferential treatment to Protestants over Catholics, who would be overrepresented in government jobs as well as in receiving the few government services that existed. A Catholic newspaper in Uganda would describe the situation as it was in the 1950s. The dispute concerning religion in Uganda is not over doctrinal differences, but about jobs and scholarships. Catholics feel aggrieved and wonder why such posts, like that of a county chief, are held by Protestants. For evidence of this fairness, try to find out about the major African officials like ministers, the Kabaka, the Mukama, and the Mugabe, and many different grades of chiefs. Note the small number of Catholics among them. But one of the reasons there was so much conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Uganda was because there just wasn't a lot of resources in Uganda to begin with, because the British didn't colonize Uganda for economic reasons. They colonized it for strategic ones. I mean, they didn't even really set it up that well to extract natural resources from. Northern Ugandans were mostly cattle herders, but because they lacked access to ports or rail, they couldn't export their beef. This resulted in families sending their sons to the south to find work in the few plantations and cities that were there. This lack of economic development in the north resulted in the British spending less money on education and other services, which was part of the British policy of making its colonies as self-sufficient as possible. Southern Uganda was predominantly agricultural and would adapt to British rule by farming cash crops. Bananas were a common crop for Eastern and Central Africa due to their relatively low maintenance and labor costs, which was especially useful in a region where the labor supply was unstable. Part of the instability was the continued existence of semi-nomadic tribes, but the much bigger cause was the nature of land ownership. Large-scale agriculture is typically dependent on large swaths of land being owned by a single entity. But in Uganda, the land was divided into smaller plots owned by families. Up until the British arrived, these plots were mostly used for subsistence farming, and after their arrival, they would take spare portions of their land to grow various cash crops in demand such as cotton and coffee. Due to most families owning their own land, this meant most people worked on their own family plot, which meant there wasn't an excess labor force to operate large plantations as elsewhere in Africa or the Western Hemisphere. This lack of spare land and laborers meant that there was little incentive for European settlers to move in and set up plantations. Just as the human and animal epidemics of the 1890s had aided the British in securing control over Uganda at a relatively little cost, so also did the economic slump of the 1920s save Uganda from a white settler population and its attendant evils on the African population. Not only did the economic conditions discourage European settlement, but the colonial government actively discouraged it in order to bring down administrative costs. Despite the lack of large plantations, the export of cotton and coffee from family farms brought in enough revenue to make the Ugandan government self-sufficient, and thus they didn't want to disrupt this system for fear that it would take too long for new white farmers to make up for the loss. White colonists were also more expensive to govern, given their greater demands for public services than the native Africans. But just because the Africans didn't have whites to compete with, did not mean there wouldn't be one foreign element there that would cause domestic consternation. In the latter half of the 19th century, a large number of immigrants from China came to the U.S. to build railroads west of the Rocky Mountains, such as the Transcontinental. Well, the U.S. wasn't the only country to import Asian laborers to build railroads across another continent. In 1896, construction of the Uganda Railway began, which would connect the landlocked colony to the Kenyan port of Mombasa. Most of the workers were from Punjabi villages in British East India, and similar to Chinese workers brought to the U.S., most of the Indian workers would stay in East Africa after the railroad's construction, and they would become the major economic competitors with the native Africans. The colonial government didn't license the growing of cotton, but they did license the operation of cotton gins. The licensing procedure was onerous, and due to the generally less educated status of the Africans, as well as having less first-hand experience with British bureaucracy than the Indians did, they were at a notable disadvantage. This resulted in the Indian community of Uganda having a de facto monopoly on processed raw materials, which sold better in the international markets. This meant that the Indians were profiting more from the export of cotton than the Africans, which fostered much resentment that would eventually explode into violence and political repression. Colonial rule also saw a reduction of internal trade within Uganda. Most of the cash crops were sold for export, and as British manufactured goods entered the market, there was little reason to buy any metal tools or clothing produced at a higher cost and lower quality from a nearby village or town. This would exacerbate the growing provincialism driven by the British policy of devolving as much governing authority to local chieftains as possible. This was a common tactic in British colonialism. Simply overlay a British layer of officials on top of a pre-existing administrative system. And the lack of European settlers in the region meant that they didn't need to set up their own government for their own people. And since most governing authority was held by the local chief or council, most of the politics was local, and thus national political movements had difficulty organizing, even when it came to movements for independence from the British. This system was codified in several ordinances over the first decades of the 20th century, which gave varying levels of authority to indigenous governments, including preserving the social structures of their kings, with the king of Buganda retaining the greatest level of power over his domain, since Buganda had been the most centralized of the Ugandan kingdoms prior to British rule. We wouldn't see any major movements for independence until after World War II. The first instances were from the Ugandan Farmers Union, who organized against the de facto Indian monopoly on cotton gin licenses, but failed due to most of the farmers' provincialism, not wanting to give an advantage to farmers in other districts. The second was the Bataka Party. The Bataka were a traditional role in Ugandan clans that used to keep and maintain clan burial grounds, but their office, as well as the significance of the burial grounds, began to shrink with the spread of Christianity. One of the British ordinances had dispossessed them of the lands and gave it to local chieftains, which resulted in the Bataka organizing under the common cause of reclaiming those lands. In the aftermath of World War II, the initial British policy was to transform its African colonies into multiracial societies. But on the ground, there were efforts at trying to keep whites on top. Various schemes for balancing power between whites, Africans, and Asians were implemented in Eastern Africa, usually through quota systems to ensure a certain percentage of public offices were held by members of different racial groups. These policies resulted in the first African being appointed to Uganda's Legislative Council in 1945. The Colonial Secretary wrote a dispatch in 1947 to issue new ordinances to speed up the democratization of the colonies. New ordinances were issued in the 50s to address the lack of Africans in Ugandan's administration, while also getting local councils more involved in the actual administration of their jurisdictions over the role of the chiefs. The late 40s saw a series of protests and riots instigated by the Bataka Party and the Farmers Union, making numerous demands such as the return of clan lands to the Bataka and the abolition of cotton gin licenses. The provincial nature of these movements resulted in most of the actions happening at the local level, with demands being sent to the King of Buganda, demanding the popular election of chiefs, as well as the popular election of representatives to Buganda's legislature, the Lukiko. The protests would fail, but some of the local leaders would go on to form new parties, such as Ignatius Musazi, who would go on to form the first national party in 1952, the Uganda National Congress, inspired by the Indian National Congress. But the UNC would also have difficulty in overcoming the provincialism of Uganda, thus leaving local branches to mostly address local concerns. One of the bigger names to come out of the UNC will be Milton Obote, who quickly rose to prominence. During the decolonization wave after World War II, the British tried to form several superstates in Africa by federating separate colonies into larger dominions. The most famous example was the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, but this fell apart in the early 60s, and saw one of its constituent parts declare independence unilaterally to preserve a white supremacist state in southern Africa. A similar scheme was floated around for East Africa between Kenya, Tanganyika, and Uganda, but pretty much all of these parties opposed it. But when the King of Buganda, Mutesa II, heard about this rumor, he protested and threatened to declare independence unilaterally if Uganda was incorporated into such a federation. Mutesa began resisting the democratization reforms the colonial government was asking him to make, which resulted in the governor, Sir Andrew Cohen, withdrawing British recognition of his kingship and exiling him to Britain, initiating the Kabaka crisis of 1953. This triggered mob violence throughout Buganda against British authority, which led the British to allow the king to return if the Lukiko drafted a new constitution that incorporated their requested reforms. The offer was accepted and Mutesa II returned in October of 1955. Although the king's powers on paper were more restricted, His political and cultural influence was greater than ever thanks to the crisis. Buganda would hold its first elections under its new constitution in 1955, with the Protestant factions winning a majority of seats in the Lukiko. One Catholic candidate, Mataya Magwanya, who had held the role of chief judge prior to the election, failed to win a seat, and would found the Democratic Party in 1956, which, although not explicitly Catholic, mostly catered to the issues of Catholics in Uganda. The king became the focal point of the growing Buganda nationalist movement, who saw the Legislative Council of Uganda as well as the national political parties as threats to Buganda. The Buganda government would file several lawsuits against the protectorate government over requirements to hold popular elections for the Legislative Council seats, which were also opposed by the Kingdom of Toro. The 1958 council election saw Buganda protest by not sending any representatives, which left the council dominated by a de facto anti-Buganda coalition. The Ugandan National Congress would win 5 seats, the Democratic Party winning 1, and 4 seats were won by independents, with the 5 remaining seats, supposed to be from Buganda, remaining empty. The protectorate government then began the process of setting up a constitutional convention, which Buganda also refused to participate in on grounds that it was going to establish standards for citizenship, which Mutesa II asserted that only an independent African government should have the right to do. At the time, there was growing anti-Asian sentiment in Buganda, and the king wanted to have the Asians excluded from citizenship so that way after independence it would be way easier to expropriate their property. The opposition to Buganda would begin to fracture in 1959, when the UNC schismed under the rival leadership of its founder, Ignatius Musazi, and one of its rising stars, Milton Obote. The Musazi faction was primarily made up of Bugandans and didn't like the direction that the rest of the party was heading, while Obote's faction was exclusively non-Bugandan. Obote's faction would merge with other anti-Buganda parties to form the Ugandan People's Congress, and thus controlled most of the Legislative Council. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would give his The Wind of Change speech, which marked the end of British colonialism in Africa, and would grant most of its colonies independence over the next decade. Macmillan's speech was preceded by a report that recommended independence for Uganda and most other African colonies. Most Ugandan parties signed on to the report, but the Buganda government would reject it, demanding a separate independence if acceptable terms weren't made. But the colonial secretary would announce elections for 1961 that would draft the constitution for an independent Uganda. Buganda and the other kingdoms all protested the announcement and demanded a federal system giving them more control over domestic affairs. There were also rumors that the king of Buganda was going to be made the head of state of the independent government, which made the king of Toro threaten to secede and join the Congo. Riots and protests became more common in the years leading up to independence, and the kingdoms and regions were all haggling with each other over disputed boundary lines that the British were trying to adjudicate. When the election for the National Assembly was held, Buganda protested by not holding the election and discouraging its people from voting. However, Buganda protesting the election resulted in the Democratic Party winning the most seats and electing a Catholic prime minister, which the predominantly Protestant Buganda government and UPC were mortified by. They decided to put aside their differences for the purpose of ousting a Catholic-led government. When the Constitutional Conference was held in London in the fall, Buganda was given the right to decide whether its representatives to the National Assembly would be popularly elected or appointed by the Lukiko, so long as the Lukiko itself was popularly elected. Additionally, Buganda was given the right to run their own civil service without any national supervision. Another round of elections to the National Assembly were called for the spring of 1962. The Democratic Party was led by the Prime Minister, Archbishop Rubaga Kinwanuka, and the UPC led by Milton Obote. But a third party would enter the race, the Kabaka, which was a Buganda nationalist party centered around Mutesa II. Elections for the Lukiko were held in February, which saw the Kabaka win nearly all the seats, and subsequently appointed Kabaka candidates to fill all 21 of Buganda's seats in the National Assembly, while the UPC would win 37 seats to the Democratic Party's 24. The UPC and Kabaka would form a coalition government, electing Milton Obote as Prime Minister, and in 1963, Mutesa II would be made the President of Uganda as well. Another conference in London in June determined that Uganda would be granted independence on October 9, 1962. At the time of independence, the Ugandan army consisted of 1,200 men, with 50 British officers and NCOs. There was a program of actively enlarging the army until 1964, when a wave of mutinies erupted across East Africa. African soldiers overthrew the Arab Sultanate of Zanzibar and expelled the Arabs from the country. This inspired mutinies in Kenya, which subsequently inspired mutinies in Uganda. Enlistees wanted higher pay, promotions, and the expulsion of white officers. Obote called on British soldiers to put down the mutiny, and several hundred Ugandan soldiers had to be discharged. At the time of independence, the Ugandan army was mostly made up of Nilotic tribes from northern Uganda, where the lack of economic development meant few opportunities for advancement. The government ultimately agreed to most of the mutineers' demands, increasing officer pay and replacing the white officers with African ones, which led to the promotion of the soon-to-be notorious Idi Amin. Amin was born to the Kakwa tribe in Kabaka County near the border with the Belgian Congo in 1928, but he was raised in Jinja by his mother. He joined the King's African Rifles in 1946 as a cook and would eventually become the Uganda heavyweight boxing champion for 9 years. He is nearly illiterate. He is politically naive. He is violently unpredictable. He is utterly ruthless. Yet he is also jovial and generous. And he has extraordinary talents for practical short-term action, for turning apparent weaknesses to his own advantage, and for asserting his leadership among his gang of thugs. During his service in the King's African Rifles, Amin's platoon was sent to fight against the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya, earning a reputation for sadism, and this record continued into his service in Uganda as well. In the spring of 1962, the King's African Rifles were sent to deal with cattle raiders in the north, and Amin's platoon was instructed to disarm the local populace, most of whom only possessed spears. During the process, he is alleged to have had all the men in a village line up, and then threatened to cut off their genitals with a machete if they didn't hand over their spears. He is also reported to have massacred a large number of tribesmen during these searches. Since this was on the eve of independence, and Amin was only one of 2 African officers in the Ugandan army, Prime Minister Obote decided to cover up the incident. He would later admit this mistake while in exile. I had been Prime Minister for only a few months when the Governor, Sir Walter Coates, asked me to go to State House. There he told me the story of the murder of the Turkana by one Lieutenant Idi Amin. As I understood it, found him guilty. Sir Walter sought my opinion whether he should confirm the sentence or not. I regret to say that part of Uganda's present suffering, sickness, and inhumanity can be traced to the opinion I gave to Sir Walter. But in his defense, Obote could not have possibly foreseen one officer with a penchant for violence rising to become a megalomaniacal dictator. And after the fall of his alliance with the Bugandans, he needed to look to the military to fill in that gap in his political alliance. And Amin was its rising star. And Obote himself became a rising star within the Commonwealth of Nations, recognized as the informal leader of the African bloc. The 1966 Commonwealth Conference saw Milton Obote leading the charge in getting the UK to lean more heavily on the regime of Ian Smith in Rhodesia. But in an intellectually awkward move, he discouraged the UK from leading the effort to sanction South Africa in the UN, believing it would economically weaken the UK, thus making it less capable of taking down Rhodesia. He used Uganda's independence celebration to determine his China policy, inviting both the PRC and ROC to send representatives. The ROC declined to send anyone, but the PRC did, which led Obote choosing to recognize communist mainland China, which Uganda continues to do to this day. He would be involved in the founding of the Organization of African Unity, where he would be one of only 2 attendees to endorse the creation of an African parliament, alongside Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He also supported the creation of a common market, a monetary union, collective defense, and a common foreign policy for the OAU. However nice one may feel as complete master in one's own house, the time has come for African independent states to surrender some of their sovereignty in favor of an African central legislative and executive body. But Obote's foreign policy would not be limited to open forums and conference rooms. He would engage in the Cold War pastime of arming rebel factions in neighboring countries. Obote was opposed to the regimes of Moise Tshombe and Mobutu in the Congo, so he put Idi Amin in charge of a secret operation to smuggle gold and ivory into Uganda, sell them, and use the money to buy weapons for anti-government rebels in the Congo. But in the process, Amin was skimming money off the top, and was caught bringing in a gold bar stamped with the insignia of the Belgian Congo into a bank. Parliament began to investigate the incident, which threatened to uncover the secret operation, in which the head of the army, Shaban Obolat, had been kept out of the loop. This crisis would be compounded by the growing tensions between Obote and Buganda. The alliance between Obote and Buganda was short-lived. The constitution that came into effect upon independence called for several districts to hold referendums to determine which region they would belong to. The disputed regions had been given to Buganda in the 1890s, but had been part of Bunyoro. Mutesa II, who was president at the time, opposed holding the votes, but Prime Minister Obote pushed forward and narrowly avoided a civil war when mobs from Bunyoro and Buganda eyed each other across their borders. The districts would vote to rejoin Bunyoro in 1964, which grievously angered the Kabaka and ended the political alliance. And if you're still watching this video at this point, then you're probably enjoying it. In which case then, could I trouble you to give this video a like? Maybe leave a comment down below about your thoughts about the video, or perhaps what future video topics you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't already, then why not subscribe to the channel and maybe click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Every little bit of interaction with the video tells the algorithm that this video has a lot of engagement and is therefore worth sharing to more people. Sorry for the double promo in one video, but if I ever want this whole thing to be more than just a little side gig for me, then I need these videos to get in front of more eyes, and doing all that really does help, so thanks a lot. And now, back to the rest of the video. In 1966, rumors began to spread that the Kabaka was preparing to announce the secession of Buganda, and the head of the army, General Shaban Opalat, had recently married a member of the Buganda royal family. In February, Obote instigated a self-coup by suspending the constitution and arresting several cabinet ministers and opposition politicians, and unilaterally removed Mutesa II from the presidency, assuming the office himself while retaining the premiership. The coup managed to kill two birds with one stone. It got rid of what little formal power the Kabaka had left within the federal government of Uganda, as well as halting the investigation into Idi Amin's embezzlement scandal. And after the coup, he would promote Idi Amin to being head of the army. 3 months later, after a new constitution was instituted, Obote had several major supporters of the Kabaka arrested, which triggered popular backlash in Buganda, with protesters throwing rocks and setting up barricades along the roads leading to the king's palace outside of Kampala. Obote would declare a military emergency in order to Amin to capture Mutesa II and secure the palace. When Amin's forces arrived, there were thousands of armed civilians within the royal grounds. After a quick call to Kampala, Amin ordered an artillery barrage, killing several hundred people. His soldiers eventually stormed the palace, but the Kabaka had managed to escape, later discovered living in exile in London. The kingdom's authority would be constitutionally abolished in 1967. The attack on the palace may have eliminated the Kabaka as a political rival, but it also meant that Obote was completely dependent on the military for his power, and he began to suspect that they were more loyal to Idi Amin than to their commander-in-chief. The army performed regular military parades in Buganda as a show of force against any potential resistance, while hundreds of prominent citizens were imprisoned without trial, including the former commander of the army, Shaban Opalat. Amin would recruit South Sudanese fleeing the civil war in Sudan to serve as mercenaries, all the while supplying arms to anti-Khartoum rebels. And when Obote had ordered these units disbanded, Amin would have these fighters redistributed to other units rather than deporting them. Amin was also building up his own power base via units that weren't part of the formal military structure, along with winning over the regular army with higher pay, promotions, and better equipment. Obote needed to build up his own base of power separate from Amin. He began by building up his own small cadre of followers within the military, which made Idi Amin suspicious. In late 1969, Obote published a series of pamphlets outlining his economic policy for Uganda, calling for a transition to socialism, with the government taking a 60% share in major private corporations. However, these policies would result in even more corruption than there already was, and angered the Indian population, who bore the overwhelming economic brunt of the cost of these policies, alongside food shortages which led to skyrocketing food prices. Several assassination attempts would be made against Obote in 1969 and 1970, which failed in killing him, but succeeded in making Obote extremely paranoid. The primary suspect was Idi Amin, who after the first attempt on December 19, 1969, fled his home when soldiers knocked down his door. He would flee to a village in northern Uganda, populated by southern Sudanese who had become loyal to him for his support of their cause. The situation would eventually be resolved, but when Amin returned to a staff meeting in Kampala, a rival officer, Brigadier General Pierno Koya, accused him of desertion on the night of the 19th. Pierno and his wife would be murdered on January 25, 1970, and Amin was the primary suspect once again. Amin's reasons for deposing Obote were growing. The investigation into the murder of General Koya were getting awfully close to linking him, as well as Obote's policies becoming less popular. He was also changing Uganda's foreign policy, siding with General Gafar Namairi of Sudan in their civil war with the South, barring Israeli planes who were delivering arms to the Southerners from refueling in Uganda, and the final straw occurred in late 1970. In September 1970, while Amin was visiting Cairo, Obote began a major restructuring of the military, promoting and appointing new officers loyal to him. Additionally, he put resources into the investigations of the murder of General Koya, But Amin would be tipped off about Obote's scheme and returned to Kampala early before Obote could finish his arrangements. And he wouldn't dare pull the trigger while Amin was still in the country and could effectively counter him. Obote's last attempt at curtailing Amin's power was by giving him a lateral promotion to a position that gave him less control over the military, but this was too little, too late. Obote was scheduled to attend a Commonwealth conference in Singapore in January 1971, but rumors of a meeting between Amin and several officers and cabinet ministers plotting an assassination and coup led Internal Affairs Minister Kayemba to order the arrest of Amin and the alleged conspirators. When Amin learned about this, he gave orders to his loyalists to seize several armories and radio stations around Uganda. At around 4 p.m. January 25th, radio stations began playing military parade music, followed by an announcement explaining why the army had taken power.
The members of the Uganda Army and Air Force decided to take over from the civilian rule because of the last arrangement which were made by the Dr. Apollo Milton Obote to disarm the whole tribe of Uganda except his own tribe Langi and Acholi. And also, that is the point which brought all this problem.
I am not a politician, but a professional soldier. I am therefore a man of few words, and I have been very brief throughout my professional career. Obote and his delegation began hearing reports about fighting going on in Kampala shortly before they left Singapore, and by the time their plane landed in Kenya, it was confirmed that the army had taken over. The investigation into the murder of General Koya was ceased, the files destroyed, and the senior officers in charge of the investigation murdered. The regime of Idi Amin had begun. I can't believe I made it through a whole video about Uganda without just dumping all of the relevant memes in the middle. So here you go.
Why are you running? Why are you running? Why are you gay?
You don't know the way.
Yes, I do.
Do you know the way?
I know the way.
You have to have Ebola to know the way.
I have Ebola.
He doesn't know the way to know.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.